Hello and welcome to Red Red. Today I'm finally making the video that I've been alluding to for a little while, but I've not yet gotten around to making it. This is where to start with William Gaddis. And I'm excited because this is my second where to start with author video. The first one I did was Vladimir Nabokov, and in that video on Nabokov I talk about how, I kind of wanted to make a video on where to start with Gaddis, but I haven't done it yet. And the reason why is because at that time I hadn't yet read Gaddis's letters, and also Gaddis's letters were the last thing of his that I had to read. So I was kind of dawdling, I was kind of procrastinating. I didn't want to finish and read the last work of Gaddis. So I left it, but then finally decided, I was like, no, I just need to close the loop and kind of contain it so that I can then bring this video hopefully and talk to you viewers about my experience reading Gaddis, what I love so much about his work, why I resonate so strongly with his ideas, and why he's sort of become one of my favorite authors. And I also really love that all of this happened over the course of the channel. So you can even go back early enough where I've not even heard of William Gaddis, and then I make videos talking about the recognitions and JR and Carpenter's Gothic, and I'm just slowly, I hope it conveys that I'm just more and more falling in love with Gaddis with every work that I read. So this is going to be a where to start with William Gaddis. I'm going to give an overview of his works, but I'm not going to talk about his works because, so this is actually my third time trying to record this, and one of the times I got about 18 minutes into the recording and I had just finished talking about JR. So it's rewind time. We're not making that mistake again. I'm going to budget essentially 30 to 60 seconds to talking about each book. And also just trust that if you're interested in getting my opinions or my thoughts on the books in particular, I have videos for quite a few of his fiction books. But the main idea or the main purpose of this video is to give you a vibe of what Gaddis explored in his writing, the order that I read his books in, and then I'll give a recommendation for maybe a different order to read his books in, which would hopefully be a more palatable way of getting into the world of Gaddis. Okay, so who Gaddis was and what his vibe was. Basically, Gaddis, so many of the ideas of William Gaddis, he basically just poured into and explored in the recognitions. He spent his whole life thinking about what it means to be an artist, what it means to create art, what it means to create genuine art, and what it means to create genuine art in modern contemporary environments where art is very commodified. From early on, even pre and at the time of the recognitions, he's collecting resources talking about the history of the player piano, which becomes his final book. So he spent his whole life thinking about mechanization of the arts. He would just spontaneously combust if he saw AI generated images. But, Gaddis was so focused not on necessarily saying, the way that people are doing art is wrong, here's the right way to do it. He's just saying there is an intuitive way or a natural way of doing art, and I want to just talk about how hard it is to do that now and in modern environments and in modern worlds and cultures. He has this bone to pick with Dale Carnegie, who comes up in every single one of his books. And again, I'm going to try and not talk for too long on the recognitions because I already made like nearly a 40-minute video talking about it. But the recognitions kind of is the amalgamation of the intense cultural information and study that Gaddis did over the course of his youth. And so there is a lot of readings of Fraser's The Golden Bow, a lot of readings of Graves' The White Goddess. He works it's an incredibly dense literary piece. There are plenty of sections where he's using multiple length. It's a multilingual book where, you have to, I ended up having to resort to sticky notes just to translate what was going on. There is an invaluable resource of the website called the Gaddis Annotations, which was made and compiled by Stephen Moore, and I'll talk a little bit about Stephen Moore later, because I didn't really realize until I read his letters how kind of close he was to William Gaddis. But so the recognitions, it is really just Gaddis saying, and he even said, he named the book The Recognitions because The Recognitions is the name, or the Clementine Recognitions is the first Christian novel, and Gaddis said, I'm going to write the last Christian novel, and it's going to have the same name. So it's his longest book. It has explorations again of this idea of how do you create genuine art. The three characters, or the three core characters, just to give you an idea of what goes on, we have Wyatt Guyon, who is an art forger who was raised in a kind of messed up religious upbringing such that he can create really genius works of art, but he's unable to create a work of genuine new art, and so he becomes an art forger. We also have Otto, who Gaddis described as a kind of author surrogate, or like a kind of self-deprecating author surrogate who has written this play that Otto is really, really proud of, but every time he shows it to somebody, they just read it and they get this eerie sensation that they've already read it, something like that somewhere. They say, this kind of reminds me a bit of Proust, or this kind of has got a Hemingway vibe here and there. And Otto just says, I have never read any of that stuff. I couldn't have copied it, which very hilariously, even in my own video talking about the recognitions, I say that it reminded me so much of Ulysses. And Gaddis himself in his letters constantly just denied having ever read Ulysses, so it's kind of funny. There's a lot of almost prophecy that happens in this book. But the last character is a man named Stanley, who is a composer, and he's very concerned with the image or the idea of being a maestro. And it is like I said, it's a very dense, if you do read it first, like I did, nothing else in Gaddis will be any harder to read, but you will essentially just have gotten the full, complete masterclass of, what Gaddis is. And there is a sense that he really didn't want to write any more books, and even especially after writing JR, he definitely didn't want to write any more books, but for financial reasons, he kind of went on and kept writing books. But yeah, if you want to hear more about the recognitions, I recommend checking out my video. I'm not going to hold you any longer. Next up is JR. That's the next book of his that was released and that I read. He spent 20 years writing JR, and a cool detail that I really like, I don't know how common this is, but because Gaddis only wrote 4 books in his life, the letters in his selected letters are all just kind of categorized or framed as, or they're like the chapters are just the names of the books he was working at the time. So there's a big chunk of just 20 years of Gaddis working on JR and all of the letters, so you can kind of feel how long it took to make the novel. But JR is, if this is kind of Gaddis exploring all of his ideas about kind of the creation of art in a, maybe it's not subtle because he's addressing these things head on, but the work is so literarily dense that it can feel like, it's so complex and so enigmatic, but really he's just, there are sections of dialogue where he's just explicitly saying, this is how I feel about art, this is how I feel about blah, blah, blah. His next book, JR, is probably Gaddis's best work. It's the most intricately crafted. It is the general idea of JR. JR is the name of a character, a young boy, who is a enigmatic kind of phantasmagoric figure who builds a paper empire by trading penny stocks. And JR is kind of this, he's almost like a manifestation of this desire, this capitalistic desire to just keep growing and keep building, but also this kind of manifestation of understanding stocks and trading and how this works to just keep building up to the point where JR is trying to find every loophole imaginable to just keep building, keep trading, trade up, trade down, lose some here, lose some there. But because JR is a young 11-year-old boy. Fun fact as well, for people who haven't read the letters, they might not know, but after JR came out, Gaddis was really gunning to get a movie made, because if you sell the rights to a movie deal, then it's a big payday, basically. And Gaddis was essentially saying that his dream would have been for Macaulay Culkin to play JR, which is kind of cool. But so in order to, because there actually needs to be a physical person, like JR is, making phone calls from his school, like phone, but the physical person, the guy who's going to meet the people and who's sort of the legwork and the body of the Leviathan, is a composer and school teacher whose name's Edward Bast. And there is this great kind of conflict where, as JR's schemes are just getting crazier and crazier and crazier, and everyone knows this person, but like no one knows who JR is. Edward Bast is a representative, and he wants to be a composer, but he's realized that there's no financial, like he's kind of at a dead end in his career. And so his work of art, he starts having this symphony that he wants to make, and then it just keeps going down, and he's like, well, maybe I can feasibly write a little fugue or something like that. And it's a really brilliant work. It explores, it's kind of basically Gaddis locking horns and taking capitalism head on. I think it's the definitive capitalism satire. He's not necessarily critical. He's not saying, oh, capitalism sucks, let's bring in communism. And he talks in his letters where he's saying that he feels like capitalism, he has a complicated relationship with capitalism that I think he explores in JR, which is why it's so great. The reason why JR is maybe a little bit easier to read than the Recognitions is that 85% of the book is dialogue. If you were to imagine it being translated into a film, it would be the sort of film maybe like Birdman, where it would just have to be one take, no cuts, and you could use cinema magic to make that happen. But there are no paragraph breaks, there are no chapters. The book is 85 to 90% dialogue, and because Gaddis uses the French or Joycean M- for dialogue, you don't know who's talking. In the Recognitions, it feels like he deliberately obfuscates who's talking, and he definitely does for kind of clever reasons. But in JR, Gaddis essentially proves that he has mastered how to write in dialect, because you know who's talking and you do have to pay attention. But again, I talked about it in my video, but it feels like you have this sort of sixth sense of knowing when JR is about to show up on the scene, and you really look and you really focus in on who's got certain dialect or affectations or mannerisms, and once you learn those, it becomes a lot easier to read the book and just to sink in. So yeah, I highly recommend that. It's the most fun book. I think it's probably his best book, a best composition, and it's really worth reading. Next up, Gaddis's next book is Carpenter's Gothic. This is kind of almost like a play. It's interesting because it is set just in this one Carpenter's Gothic house, and it explores this domestic relationship where it can be a bit hard to read, because there are times where you feel like Gaddis has just straight up copy-pasted arguments that he's had with different wives. But nevertheless, it shows a development in Gaddis's career, because he starts to move a little bit more into fleshing out and having more, giving female characters more agency, and that comes into play a lot more in A Frolic of His Own. But it's so the interesting thing with A Frolic with Carpenter's Gothic is that much of the in the Recognitions and JR, there's this idea that a lot of the stuff is happening in the background and you're just not aware of it. In Carpenter's Gothic, the stuff is happening in the background, but it's much more literal because it's happening outside of the house, where most of the book of Carpenter's Gothic is just set inside the house. And so you're getting phone calls, or you're listening to the TV, or getting news articles, and just kind of fragments of conversation from people who are coming in and going in the house. But it's just all generally set in this one Carpenter's Gothic house, which is modeled after a house that Gaddis actually lived in. I recommend this as either the first or the second Gaddis book that you read, because it is quite short. It is still very brilliant. There's just like insane stuff going on in the background. Like there's the husband of the main character. He's gotten in and is starting to try and work and build up this scheme with this reverend in the background, or this pastor who has accidentally drowned a kid in a botched baptism, and now the reverend is going and like trying to say that it's actually this great gift from God that this tragedy has happened. And there's like really insane stuff going on that it just doesn't click straight away because you're set inside this house. But yeah, Carpenter's Gothic, again, not going to talk much about it because I did make a video on it, but I think that even though Gaddis really didn't want to write any more novels, I'm glad he did, because I think that Carpenter's Gothic is a great, worthy kind of addition. It's like a Victorian novel. It's got all of or a Gothic novel. It's got all of the traits, with the kind of like the love affair and whatnot. But yeah, Carpenter's Gothic is also awesome. A Frolic of His Own is Gaddis digging a hole way too deep, learning about the law and learning about the legal system. In A Frolic of His Own, everyone is suing everyone. It has still got this great Gaddis wit. There's this... It starts off where one of the main characters has tried to hotwire his car to get it started, but then because the brake slipped, his car ran over him and he got injured by it. And so he's trying to sue the car company, who are saying, well, why were you hotwiring the car? And the brand of the car is called So Sue Me. And anyway, just to like set the stage and to introduce some of Gaddis's great humor. But the main idea of A Frolic of His Own, throughout his life, Gaddis was working on a play called Once at Antietam. I'm sorry, I don't know the name of it. It's kind of like a civil war. And this play comes in and is incorporated in A Frolic of His Own because the main character has written that play, sent it off to get published, nothing ever happened, and then he goes and sees this movie or this film that's a great success. It's got its own controversies, but it's a great success, and it's similar to some of the stuff that he wrote. Of course, you can't just copyright the Civil War, but the main character is desperately grasping and trying to say like, oh no, this person read my thing and stole it. And so he's trying to get his sister's husband, who is a lawyer, to sue him. And there is this it is just a book of everybody suing everybody. And it is like how JR is a very kind of deep and almost like grabbing capitalism by the gonads. This is Gaddis. The cool thing with this one is that it's Gaddis attempting to grasp the law and then realizing he is desperately unmatched. The book can't possibly, it could just collapse. And he talks about that a lot in his letters, where he just says the amount of stuff that I've had to cut because it's just unnecessary. It could be books and books and books. So A Frolic of His Own, I didn't make a video on it, partly because I felt like you had to love Gaddis by the time you were reading that. I didn't necessarily feel like it was a great way to introduce it. I didn't know that much that I could even really say about it. But in my new recommended reading order, I recommend reading that last. Finally, Agape Agape is Gaddis's swan song. It is him writing in a Thomas Bernhard style, just one unbroken paragraph, compacting all of the ideas that he has ever done or that he has had throughout his life, particularly the mechanization of the arts, and he just squeezes it into a 100-page book that was eventually kind of compiled and released posthumously. Those are Gaddis's 5 books. Still ended up taking ages talking about them, my apologies, and that is the order that I read them. I also read his essay collection, A Rush for Second Place. I recommend reading that even after you've read his letters, if you read them. And then finally, I read his letters, of course. That's the reading order. I read The Recognitions, JR, Carpenter's Gothic, A Frolic of His Own, Agape Agape, Rush for Second Place, and then his letters. Although I'm glad that I went through and did that because of my own personal preference for reading authors chronologically, my recommended reading order for an audience is this: Agape Agape, Carpenter's Gothic, J.R., The Recognitions, A Frolic of His Own, Gaddis's Letters, The Rush for Second Place. The reason why I put The Rush for Second Place even at the end is that really, aside from the title essay, which you can kind of find and read online or even listen to a lecture of Gaddis talking about it online anyway, everything else, all of the other essays are just fine or just extra biographical details, which, unless you're already interested in Gaddis as a person, I just don't think it's going to be as worthwhile. But the reason I recommend Agape Agape first, again, it is all of Gaddis's ideas just compacted into a 100-page book that you can read in essentially a day or two. I then recommend Carpenter's Gothic because you will be introduced to Gaddis's great prose style without necessarily needing to get into the very dense literary work that are his first two novels. Then I recommend J.R. because it is probably just his best, and you should, you really owe it to yourself to read J.R. After that, if you're not turned away by the density and by the kind of intensity of Gaddis, I recommend moving on to The Recognitions. And then finally, if you can be bothered, if you're really a Gaddis stan, I would recommend going and reading A Frolic of His Own. That's why I recommend William Gaddis. I need to find some time to go back and reread The Recognitions. I still, occasionally flick through and find some great quotes to read because there's such beautiful writing in it. But yeah, I think now I'm still just kind of digesting and being in the wake of having read all of Gaddis. And again, I want to point out and talk about Stephen Moore, who I thought that Stephen Moore was just kind of a distant scholar of Gaddis, but I didn't realize that from about the time when Gaddis is working on Carpenter's Gothic, Stephen Moore is already talking to him, already working on the Gaddis annotations. There are plenty of letters to Stephen Moore in the book. And again, I just really want to thank Stephen Moore for all of the work that he's done in compiling the Gaddis annotations and working with Gaddis throughout his life. So again, thank you, Stephen Moore. I know you're still working and you're still doing awesome stuff. So one more time, held in high regard. Thank you again for watching. I hope that this has given you some idea and maybe some ideas for how you should go about reading Gaddis if you want to get into the world. I really do recommend that there is a more palatable way to get in rather than just reading chronologically. But if you want to read like how I did, I went through and did it just full chronological release order. Thank you again for watching. Hopefully this is the start of your journey of getting into the works of William Gaddis. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.